Hey there, everybody. Welcome to another edition of But Before We Go. I'm Bill Woodcock.
And I'm Steve Hunt.
And Steve, for today's entertainment, we have the Star Wars phenomenon. Steve, it is summer blockbuster season. Have to admit, this summer movie season's been a little bit so far. There are
Mhm.
still blocks out there that need to be busted. However, those of us in Gen X remember 47 years ago, 44 years ago, 41 years ago, even 29 years ago, 26 years ago, 23 years ago, when the Star Wars movies were the talk of the summer movie season. Steve, talk to me a little bit about what the Star Wars phenomenon, Star Wars experience has meant to you.
Well, it's certainly a very important part of childhood and growing up. And I, I could be wrong because maybe I'm biased because it was the first movie that resonated with me. But I don't know that I remember this whole concept of the summer blockbuster before Star Wars. Um, it just seemed to be movies just came out when they came out. I think the next one after Star Wars was maybe Jaws. The following year, I think that came out in '78. Was the original Jaws maybe? Or maybe it was maybe I'm thinking about a sequel or something. I don't know. But I just remember Star Wars being the first movie that really did dominate the summer season. And it came along at a time that I think for Gen Xers, it really landed because of several things. Number one, times were tough in the summer of 1977. We're coming off of Vietnam. We're coming off of Nixon. The economy in the 70s, not that we're going to go into the political stuff in the 70s, but let's just say 70s were a bit of a mess. And I think there was a need to escape. And Star Wars did that. And it also touched into something that was really resonating with certainly me as a kid and my friends. And that was things beyond the stars or things beyond this planet. We grew up with Star Trek, for example. We grew up with, I don't know about you, but I grew up with comic books that were always well beyond this planet. We had the Apollos, we had the Apollo Soyuz. There was this new thing that was about to launch, I believe, called a space shuttle. I think the first space shuttle might have been in '77 or '78, but so space was a thing, and Star Wars captured all of that and really fascinated people with these adventures in a galaxy far, far away. And it just for me, it landed really hard. I didn't even see it the first weekend, but I just heard about it from my friends. They're like, "Oh, you got to see this thing! It is so cool." Made it to the old theaters at the old Landover Mall. Um, Actually got a little bit of Farrell's for dinner to go with it, and of course, Farrell's meant ice cream for dessert. So we made a whole experience out of it, and it certainly is a fond memory of childhood. Of that first Star Wars movie, then obviously as the sequels were coming out, the excitement was already built in because you wanted to see what they were going to do next. How about you, Bill?
Well, you were almost 100% correct there. Well, on your dates. I
Hmm.
mean, your opinions are your opinions, Steve, and you are entitled to them. But on your dates, Jaws 2 came out in 1978, so
Ah,
before the original Star Wars and Empire Strikes Back. The original Jaws may have actually been the first summer blockbuster. That came out in 75.
okay.
Um, and then you mentioned the space shuttle. The space shuttle didn't take off until 1981. That was the first mission,
Ah,
but the
okay.
program was already underway. But you're absolutely right about the significance of, I think, of Star Wars. I mean, I can remember my dad taking me to this movie called Star Wars and saying, "Oh, you want to see this? Because it's just like Star Trek." It actually wasn't anything like Star Trek.
No.
It's a totally different type of sci-fi. Um, it got me interested in science fiction literature, which I read voraciously
Hmm.
through middle school. Ray Bradbury, Isaac Asimov, the Dune books and all that. Pardon me. And it just got me, you know, Star Wars was, as George Lucas said, a Western.
Mm, mm,
You had and it was crossed with a samurai film, right? The original. You had the old aging warrior going up against his younger apprentice. There's
mhm,
an even younger old tough who's looking to take the new king of the hill down. And there's a whole motley crew of scoundrels, quite literally, and beautiful women and assistants and
mhm,
comic relief and second bananas who play a part.
mhm,
So it was really, and it was a beautifully done movie. I mean, I think one thing that was pioneering in that day was the cinematography. The
mhm.
cinematography was amazing. And who can remember? I mean, it was one of the most unforgettable opening scenes in movies where you saw the rebel ship go. Oh, and I'm going to use. I hope I have the right perspective on my screen here. And you're like, whoa, that's a cool looking ship.
Yeah,
And then you saw the Imperial Star Destroyer go.
and that was right after the scroll part, right?
What's that?
That was right after they did the whole scroll of, the
Well,
episode,
yeah, and the
and
scroll
then you
was
see
cool
that right
too.
after.
That's a good thing you remember. The scroll was good too.
Mhm,
And then people were like, "Hey, what the hell? How could that little ship be fighting that huge ship? What is going on here?" I mean, it was just very, very cool.
yeah,
I really believe that. I mean, I don't know how many movies had sequels. Of course, there had been, during the 40s and 50s and
mhm,
30s, the movie serial, but full-blown movies that had sequels. I mean, they
right,
could have had sequels. Wizard of Oz was one of multiple books. They never did a sequel to The Wizard of Oz, except many years later, and that sucked.
mhm,
But there was never really a big time sequel to a movie. I mean, there were like, the novelizations of Sherlock Holmes, well,
mhm,
the movie versions of Sherlock Holmes novels, James Bond novels.
right,
Yes, those could be considered sequels, but one part of the story did not attach to the end of the old story did not attach to the beginning of the new story necessarily.
right,
In the James Bond movies, they didn't film them in order.
right.
So it was really a fascinating concept, and the American public, the global public, just ate it up. I
Yep,
mean, how many things now are came from Star Wars? I mean, of course, there's Star Wars Day in May, May the 4th. May the
mhm,
4th be with you. How many people now talk like Yoda, do or do not, there is no try.
mhm.
How many people say, I've got a bad feeling about this? How many people say, Luke, I am your father? I
Oh my god,
mean, I
that's a
mean,
big
there's just all these things in the vernacular that I don't think you can put your finger on any other, series of movies. And to be there at ground zero for when that happened, or time zero for when that happened, it was really cool. It was really fun. And I really had the awareness that I was part of something that was interesting culturally. I mean, I guess
Mhm,
maybe the Harry Potter movies and books would
sure.
be similar in this generation, but even then, I don't think you could beat Star Wars.
Well, to your point, Bill, the whole idea of a sequel as a continuation, because you're right, the Bond movies were not necessarily a continuation, and you're right, they were written out of order. You could talk about the Clint Eastwood spaghetti westerns, and by the way, I love the western analogy. I don't know that I ever heard that interview, but you're absolutely right. It does have all the adventures of a western, and maybe even a pirate movie with some swashbuckling and stuff like that. So Lucas did take some of those elements And of course, when we were kids, what was bigger than westerns in the 60s and into the 70s, right? So you could tie that in, and he took it into outer space. But I would argue that a lot of movies and TV shows happened because Star Wars was so successful that people said, huh, outer space. We need to come up with outer space type stuff because, as you know, not too long after the original Star Wars movie, Gene Roddenberry and crew decided, huh, let's bring back that 60s series that, oh, by the way, for people who don't know, Star Trek was only on for a couple of seasons, excuse me. It was not this long running series. It was quick and dirty and out of there, but because people had that renewed interest, he said, let's roll out Star Trek the Motion Picture, which launched a whole Star Trek, pardon the pun, enterprise with the original crew of the Next Generation and Deep Space Nine and Voyager, and I can go on and on and on. And the reboots now with the Chris Pine, young Captain Kirk versions. Think about TV shows from. I remember a show called Space 1999. I don't know if you remember that with Martin Landau, Barbara Bain. Um, Space 1999, Buck Rogers, which originally was an old comic book, old TV show. I think back in maybe the 50s or something. I don't know. Hell, they even tried to roll out Flash Gordon. I think the only good thing about that movie was the soundtrack because Queen was like that.
Yeah, it was.
Soundtrack was like that. The movie was like, I don't know. Um, but all of that, and obviously all the Star Wars stuff you just mentioned, I think became possible because this little movie uh, came out that everybody was so into. And obviously, another young director at the time, although he was much younger than George Lucas, a guy by the name of Spielberg, decided, hey, I could do some of this stuff too. And, from the Indiana Jones to E.T., you could put a pin in 1977 that summer and say everything we're seeing now, including all the Marvel stuff come to life, started there because it made it possible that you didn't have to make the same old movie about the movies were either horror movies or about gangsters or comedies. Not that I don't appreciate all of those, but he took us to another place and people like going there. And it inspired others to say, let's take the people there.
Well, don't forget, Steven Spielberg had directed the aforementioned Jaws,
True.
and before that had directed a couple of pretty cool movies. One called Duel, which was a thriller,
Hmm.
and then another one called well, no, that was Spielberg, but no, George Lucas actually directed American Graffiti,
Yes.
which had in its ensemble cast one Harrison Ford.
Yeah, that's true. Yes.
So, so that was very interesting. But your point is very well taken. I mean, the effect of Star Wars in movies, I think, is felt today. Before Star Wars came out, what was the best science fiction movie? It was probably Fantastic Voyage.
Yeah.
I mean, from the 1950s.
Yep.
Planet of the Apes movies had a certain impact, but there was that whole dystopian theme in the end of the 60s.
Yeah.
Planet of the Apes, Soylent Green, Silent Running, all of that stuff. But Star Wars was a different time, and 2001 was a film. And I
Yes.
love 2001, but it was a Stanley Kubrick film.
Yeah.
It wasn't a science fiction movie.
But hey,
Just happened to have science fiction as its backdrop,
if nothing else, it gave Ric Flair his music.
which is very important. But anyway, you digress. Um, but Star Wars ushered in so much. I mean,
Yes.
Close Encounters of the Third Kind came out,
Yep.
Spielberg directed.
Yep.
The Superman movies came out, the original ones with Christopher Reeve.
That's true. Yes.
You
I found
mentioned Star Trek. Star Trek, remember, was not that popular.
no.
And it just caught fire in syndication. And there had been plans to make a second television series about Star Trek, but they decided to make it movies. And then you make mention of, all the way through. to the Marvel movies. I think it's a very apt comparison. But let's back up a little bit on some little folklore about the Star Wars movies that people don't always touch upon, but we do because we're that way. Star Wars started out with the middle three episodes of a
Right.
triple triptych, a 9 chapter story.
Hmm.
And then they went back, what, 15 years later, give or take,
Yeah.
and took on episodes 4, 5, and 6. And then another 10 years or 15 years later, episodes 7, 8, and 9.
Right.
And I can remember there being varying opinions about that. Like when Star Wars had come out and they said there was going to be Empire Strikes Back. Then eventually they said there was going to be then Revenge of the Jedi. That
Hmm.
this is the middle trilogy of 9.
Hmm.
And then Lucas said, oh no, there's actually only going to be 6 movies. And then later, while the prequel trilogy was happening, he was like, oh no, there's going to be 9 movies. There was always going to be 9 movies. I never said there was going to be 6. But it was a good thing to start out with 4, 5, and 6. Because I
Yeah.
think if they would have started out with one, people would have been like, what the hell's this?
Yeah. Well, rumor had it, and speaking of folklore, was that 4, 5, and 6 were picked on purpose because they were the ones that Lucas and his team felt were sellable. That 4, 5, and 6 were such that it would draw people in because of Luke and Han and Leia and the rest and Darth and all of that. That it made the most sense to roll out those because they were going to get people into the theater. And you're right. I don't think episode one, I think you roll out with the Phantom Menace and we may not have seen not only Star Wars, but a whole lot of other stuff because that would have been a problem. Because episode one was your classic setup movie. And it did not have the let's just say it did not have the Death Star blowing up at the end to make everybody cheer in the theater, which I don't know about you when you saw it, but when the Death Star blew up, everybody went nuts. It was, it was this communal moment where everybody was just cheering. I think there were moments after the Death Star blew up. Good thing there was no dialogue because nobody would have heard it because everybody was like, yeah. And then, of course, the ooh ah when you see the TIE fighter spinning off with Darth Vader, and you know that, oh boy, Darth Vader ain't gone. But as far as the block of movies, obviously I'm not close to George Lucas. I don't know anybody on his team, but I have a sneaky feeling that somewhere in the mind of George Lucas, he rolled out 4, 5, and 6 and said, okay, this is great. There's still some nostalgia. It's always on TV. People are always watching it on cable. Let's try this 1, 2, and 3. Let's roll out the origin story. People are going to want to know where this Darth Vader and how the Empire came to be. And I believe, and again, this is a conspiracy theorist in me. I believe the response to 1, 2, and 3 led him to keep going because he just didn't want to go out like that. Because of 1, 2, and 3, three kind of landed. Actually, Sith is my favorite of the second block. But it kind of landed, but the series did not. And I just have a feeling they were like, you know what, we got to throw something else out here. We cannot end on this note. And I could be dead wrong. Disney got involved, and the money train has to roll, and maybe that's why they kept rolling them out. But I don't know. I have a feeling that something that George Lucas said, I got to keep going because I can't go out like this.
Well, yeah, I mean, he did sell out to to Disney between the prequel um episode trilogy and episode 7, 8, and 9. So, and then the storytelling was taken over by Disney, and then that happened as it happened. But we have about 10 minutes left in this fine podcast production, and we haven't even talked about the coolest things yet, which was the stuff.
Ha!
Steve, tell us what sort of Star Wars stuff you had growing up. Hell, if you have Star Wars stuff now, tell the people.
I had the Millennium Falcon. That's all I wanted. I mean, I know there were all the action figures you could get and all of that, but I wanted the Falcon because that ship was so cool looking. And in the movie theater on the big screen, which I would tell anybody if you're going to see a Star Wars movie, you got to see it on the big screen at least once. Um, it just looked cool, especially when it made its dive into the Death Star. It was moving around. I mean, I just had to have that ship. I got it that Christmas, and I would just move around the house holding this thing up, pretending like it was flying. Um, was not big on the action figures. I had
Wait,
the
hold
small
up,
figures, but yes,
hold up. Before you continue, why did you have the Millennium Falcon and not any action figures to go with it? It was primed for there to be action figures to go with it. It had the little table with the little chessboard
I
where
know.
3PO and Chewbacca play video chess, and Luke says, "Let the Wookiee win." It has the little probe where
Yep.
Luke learned more about the ways of the Force before Alderaan was proven to have been blown to smithereens. It had a little cockpit where you could put Han and Chewie in and put Ben Kenobi behind and
hmm
have Ben say, "That's no moon, it's a space station." Please tell me you at some point you had action figures, and do go on with what else you had.
I had a couple of the action figures eventually. I didn't have many of them, but I think I might have had maybe Solo and Chewie because they were in the cockpit of the ship. But to me, it was all about the ship. Um, so those are really the ones I can remember having that I really, really, really wanted. Um, but yeah, Star Wars. I know people had the whole collection and added to the collection as the Star Wars movies moved on. You got Boba Fett, and when Empire came back, and you got his, I forget the ship that he flew around in, and so I know people who did the serious collecting. But to me, I was good with just the Falcon and a couple of figures to go in the cockpit. But Bill,
I
talk
had so
about
much crap.
you sound like you're a man who had a sprawling collection. So
Yeah,
do know there, sir.
yeah. I had like 8 stormtroopers,
Oh, good lord.
5 Jawas, 3 Sand People, like 5 of the snow troopers. I had a few of the Ugnaughts. I had a Yoda. Love my Yoda. Had all the play sets. Had the Hoth play set and the Dagobah play set, which was the Hoth play set, except it was in brown.
hmm
Oh no, the Tatooine play set was the Hoth play set. The Dagobah play set had a little piece of foam rubber in it, which was quicksand. And so you don't let the quicksand go on. And it also the Tatooine play set had a little sand crawler in the back with a lever where you can move the figures up and down. It
Uh-huh.
had the Death Star, which was like 4 levels. It had the trash compactor again with little foam rubber pieces of trash. And a trash monster with a little eye sticking up, peeking around, going, "Hey, dudes." Had all that, had the X-Wing, the TIE Fighter, Darth Vader's TIE Fighter, Millennium Falcon, the Land Speeder, the Rebel, the troop carrier, that little thing. I had so much shit. I had the die-cast vehicles. I had the TIE Bomber
Wow.
from Empire Strikes Back.
Yep.
I had so much crap it was absurd. My dad, of course, got rid of it all. So I had the comic book, the Marvel comic books movie adaptation, issues 1 through 4 of Star Wars, which included scenes that never made it into the final cut, like when early on, or like a scene that happens that should have happened very early in the movie, where Luke is actually watching through his binoculars
hmm
the battle between the rebel ship and the Star Destroyer, and he's talking to his friend Biggs, who's about to leave and go join the academy.
hmm
I had all this stuff, and
Wow.
it's poofed. It's gone. I'm actually endeavoring to get back the Star Wars figures
Hmm.
because I did have those all the way up through episode 6. And I
Mm.
now have what I had, and I know which how many of which one I had. Am I interested so much in prequel prequel movies or the sequel movies? I don't know.
Hmm.
But it took me 15 years to rebuild my baseball card collection. If this is what it takes to get all my Star Wars figures back, I'll do that. That said, I have absolutely no place to display this crap,
Right.
but I want to have it.
But you're talking about
So
some high dollar stuff, man. If you would have had that original stuff, my God, you could have went to a Star Wars convention and been like the man. I mean, being able to whip out stuff literally from the 70s and the 80s. I mean, my goodness, that is too bad that
my,
stuff got lost.
my father was not a wise person. And then plus, I remember having T-shirts with like Star Wars iron-on transfers on them,
Mm.
and just all sorts of stuff.
Well, it was
And in fact,
everywhere.
in recent weeks, in fact, studying for this very podcast production, I have been bombarded, Steve, with ads for lightsabers. And it's no friggin' joke. I mean, you can buy a lightsaber. I mean, of course, it is not a real saber, but
Hmm.
it has a plastic tube with a line of LED lights. Some of these hook up to an app. You can literally make the color of your lightsaber any of what 16.2 million color possibilities.
Hmm.
You can give it any one of like 32 different sounds when it hits something, sound selections when it whooshes through the air,
Hmm.
different models, different types of hilts. You can either have one that's based on your favorite character or one that's in a book or make it up.
Hmm.
It is insane. These things cost several $100s. Who
Yeah.
the hell has $500 for a lightsaber? If you've
Yeah.
got $500 for a lightsaber, that $500 should be doing something else.
Yeah, I mean, there is being an enthusiast and being into it, and then there's spending $500 on a lightsaber. I mean, that's next level. I mean, God love you if you've got that type of disposable income. That's more power to you. But that is a wow moment. But I know we're getting ready to wrap up, Bill. But I guess a couple of things that we have to talk about. Uh, and I'm gonna do this two ways. Favorite Star Wars movie, and you can pick from each set, or you can pick just one of all time, and then taking it to modern times, favorite movie not within the Star Wars universe proper. Some of these offshoots. Were there any of those that resonate with you?
Oh, so favorite movie of the nine is Empire Strikes Back, followed closely by episode 4, which I guess now they call A New Hope.
Yeah.
And for your second question, are you talking about any of the Star Wars universe?
Yes. Yeah. Something that landed with you.
Well, um, I really dug episode 1 of The Mandalorian. I mean, not episode 1, season 1 of The Mandalorian.
Mm-hmm.
I thought that was a very cool concept. I'm interested in what they do with it now that it's going to be a movie. Um, I kind of think with season 3, it went on a little bit too long, although I loved, learning, about, the Katie Sackhoff character and more about the Mandalorian culture and what
Mm-hmm.
being a Mandalorian means. But I just thought that it got back to the original. I mean, to your point about the the cowboy with no name, this Clint
Mm-hmm.
Eastwood character.
Yes.
I think that's the Mandalorian.
Well, it really is the Western. And I think that one really truly did go back to what you would say the roots of Star Wars as a space western is. So
Well,
that's
what
why.
about you?
Well, I was going to say that's why the Mandalorian, as far as within the universe, landed with me. I'm still needing to catch up on the Mandalorian, but season one I really loved, and it did feel like a western, and I think that is true to the original intent of Star Wars. You know, the I'll call it the original set. As far as the movies, it's Empire. I mean, there's just so much about that movie that lands hard. You know, you meet Landau Calrissian, who's just a character. You know, there's the whole scene with Luke and Vader, and I'm your father. Um, it really just it is the best of the bunch. I'm with you. A New Hope was also awesome. Not as good as Empire, I think, because there was some setup there, so it didn't move as fast as Empire. Um, and I think everybody, if you're looking at the first three Star Wars movies, Jedi just did not land very well. It was good. Don't get me wrong, but the Ewoks, I just wasn't feeling them. Um,
They were
and
made for toys. They were made for Toys R Us characters, Steve.
yeah, it felt that's when Star Wars started to feel really commercial. Even though there was like 8 zillion things you mentioned, half of those products that were out there, but that's when it really started to feel like okay, this is really commercial here. But again, a great movie, a great universe. I think that it is today running the risk of oversaturation, as is the Marvel series, because there's just so much of it. Maybe they'll start breaking it up to where it's not so much of it. But we're talking about 1977 in the original, and it was truly a moment of time. Especially being a kid, it was really cool. I mean, you wanted to you wanted to be. I don't know about you, Bill, but I wanted to be Han Solo. Luke was the hero, but to me, Han Solo was the cool dude. You wanted to grow up to be Han Solo because he was just the man.
Well, we will revisit much more about Star Wars. I feel like we've only really touched the surface, but we will see what character I would identify with in a latter episode. It's not the one you might think. But I am proud that we went 33 minutes of a podcast and did not say the words Jar Jar once.
Oh God,
So, with that, in our next episode, we will have Dr. Cynthia Steele, a special guest, host of the From Bench to Boardroom podcast, talk about that great staple of our childhood television, Schoolhouse Rock.
so
Until
excited.
then, for Steve, I'm Bill. This has been But Before We Go. Bye now.